Hi, my name is Claire and I'm the mother of 3 teenagers with FASD.
I'm Jessica, a PhD researcher specialising in educational interventions for children with FASD.
And together we are the hosts of Spotlight on FASD, the UK's first podcast dedicated to shining a spotlight on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders.
FASD is a condition caused by prenatal alcohol exposure that affects hundreds of thousands of children across the UK.
And we're here to bring these conversations out of the shadows and make sure that no one living with FASD feels alone.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the latest episode of Spotlight on FASD. This will be our second episode of season 3, where we're focusing the entire season on education and FASD, everything related to FASD and education really. So FASD in the classroom, all the way up to educating people about FASD and how that looks. So today, for those of you watching on YouTube, you will already have noticed that I am on my own. So I don't have Claire with me this week. And so this will be shorter because I don't have anybody to bounce off. Having said that, that's also a bit of a call for guests. If anybody would like to reach out to us, get in contact on social media or via email, anything like that, Spotlight on FASD. If you'd be interested in coming on and having a bit of a chat with us, if you work with somebody with FASD in a classroom or any sort of learning environment, if you're a caregiver and have anything to say about FASD in education, we would love to hear from you, and hopefully you will be able to come on and join me so that I'm not talking to myself again, because this is a little bit strange, it's a bit odd. I'm missing Claire already. We're only 2 minutes in. Anyway, this week we were due to be talking about how to identify FASD in the classroom and what you can do about that, how we suggest that you proceed with any students that you suspect may have FASD. So last week's episode, we just touched on FASD in the classroom, very, very much, as we titled the episode, the tip of the iceberg, really just like scraping the surface of what FASD looks like in a classroom environment and the impact of any disengagement with education, and why it's really, really important to see FASD as soon as possible so that we can provide supports and interventions. But how do you see it? Like, what do you see? So there's a couple of things. Well, there's probably a lot of things. But the main things I think that would be highlighted to an educator, an education professional, anybody who is working in that capacity, is probably behaviours that are not what you would hope for in a classroom setting. So they might not necessarily be negative behaviours, but not in line with what you would be hoping for. So we always say, and you will find this in communities that work with children with disabilities, children who have experienced trauma, care experienced, all that kind of thing. But behaviour is a form of communication, and it's really, really important to understand what is going on behind the behaviour. So what exactly is that child or that young person trying to tell us that they are unable to tell us, and that we need to figure out, what's going on and how we can best support them. So in terms of FASD specifically, we do see a lot of behaviours that we would normally associate with ADHD, autism, a lot of hyperactivity, but also, as we've mentioned before in previous podcasts, there will be a disengagement that looks either like the child is not listening and not paying attention, or they are being disruptive and problematic within that environment. So what does that look like for FASD? You will have heard us mention before that children with FASD, people with FASD, generally speaking, will only be able to process every third word of what you say. So they are hearing instruction and they are absorbing in the instruction, and they will be able to repeat, in some cases, that instruction back to you, parrot fashion, perfectly, repeated back, which is very convincing. It's really, really hard to then think that they haven't processed what you just said. So really, really important there, if you have a child who doesn't appear ever to be acting on, well, not ever, but if there's instances where the same child keeps coming up and you feel like, oh God, they never listen to me, they never do what they're told, perhaps consider repeating the information, slowing right down, and repeating what you've asked in as short and concise sentences as possible. So very, very short, very, very simple. We don't, in normal circumstances, we don't need to discuss the whats and the whys and the ifs and the buts, just very simple instruction. And then wait a few moments, allow them to process it, and then repeat the same information in the exact same language. So that might be an indicator. So that regularly not listening to you or not acting on instruction is a possible indicator. So have that tool in your pocket. Repeat the information, slow down, deliver the information, pause, repeat in the exact same language. Pause. You may need to go a third time. You may need to repeat it a fourth time. And whilst you're doing that, just try and minimize any distractions around you, because every time you repeat it, if they're only hearing every third word, every time you repeat your instruction, they're getting more and more of that information. More and more of that information will be processed. But if there's a million different things going on around them, like it's going to become harder. It's going to take a lot longer. There's so many distractions in place that are going to make it very, very difficult. So that's one thing. With that conversation as well, that dialogue that you hold with the student, just consider that the processing challenges that people with FASD can often have, it doesn't mean that the information won't get there. It doesn't mean that it's not going through. It just means that it's taking much longer. So the information is still working its way through the brain, and it will get there eventually, or there might be a roadblock there that looks like dinner being served, or the school bell going off, or somebody running past the window, and that thought has been lost before it arrives at the destination it needs to. So that's something to consider. I'm trying not to get too much into strategies here, because we will be breaking all this down in real detail as we come through this season. But that's just one thing. Like, if you see that, and that is a possible indicator, there's something that immediately that you could do, and that might be a further indicator, to be honest. If that works, you might find that, like, oh right, okay, yeah, that suggests that suggests even further that it could be FASD. So as I mentioned before, hyperactivity is another one. Unable to sit still, very, very distracted. This, it's also children, isn't it? It's really, really hard. But you will notice a difference, and it's not an immediate indicator of FASD at all. It could be an indicator of so many things. So you're really building a bit of a list here as to what might be going on there. Another thing that you'll have heard us mention many, many times is that FASD is far more prevalent within the care experienced population. So if you know that a child has come from a background of trauma of any kind, again, just keep FASD in the back of your mind. Learn a little bit more about it, learn a little bit more about how to support students with FASD, because some of these things that we're suggesting, some of the strategies that we'll go into in future episodes, they might help, but they will never harm. And I think that that's really important to remember. So, you know, even if you think it might be FASD, but it doesn't turn out to be that, and it's something completely different, none of what we have discussed and will discuss in future episodes would ever harm a student. It will never hurt to repeat information. It will never hurt to have movement breaks and things like that. Like it's worth trying, because if it can support the child and help them engage better in learning, then why not give it a go? Why not? So coming back to the hyperactivity and just the lack of engagement, movement breaks would be really important for students with FASD, and you have to really get to know the student. You have to get to know their challenges, get to know their strengths, but you will soon learn to understand when that time is up, like when you have lost engagement, when they're just done. So that would be another way to identify it in the classroom. I'm trying to think what else, because there is so many. And when you learn actually outside the classroom, that's another thing. Social interaction. So this is a big one, and it didn't come to the forefront of my mind. And I should have had notes, but for everybody watching on YouTube, you don't want to see the top of my head all the time. But social interaction is an out of classroom thing, but during playtimes, break times, dinner times, things like that, you might find that there's a student that very rarely interacts with other students, or when they do, it becomes particularly challenging or problematic. The other children might not quite understand that this particular child that you have in question, and it just becomes quite an interesting social dynamic that, as an educator or as somebody based within a school or any context like that, that just flags up and makes you think like, I wonder what's going on there. I wonder why that student isn't interacting with their peers or things like that. And that can come down, this is another indicator, but that can sometimes come down to the fact that developmentally they are functioning at an age much lower, sometimes even half of their chronological age. So behaviours can be quite silly or more childlike than their age and their peers, and that can be a reason for that, the social challenges to start to display there. And that would be another indicator for anybody working with children with FASD as well, because you will start to pick up on things like that, like quite childlike interests or humour, or things where they just appear quite a bit younger than the other children in the classroom and their peers, but they look their age. They may be working academically to their age. They may be able to use expressive language that is far older than their age. This is something that we touched on last week, and all the different variances of FASD. So none of the things that I've mentioned, it's not a tick box exercise, is what I'm trying to say. So it's not like, okay, yeah, we've got hyperactivity, we've got this slow processing, not listening to instruction, we've got this childlike behaviour, and we've got social interaction challenges, tick, 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 this child must have FASD. That's not how it works. These are just some of the things. And I think many educators, many learning professionals who get to know the students that they're working with will start to see different behaviours out of line with the other students in their class. I think, you know, as a professional, you would know something would highlight to you that there's a bit more going on for this particular child than what it appears. Now, there's a few things that can be done. You might be in a position where you could highlight that you believe it may be FASD. You might be able to highlight that child for a diagnostic pathway, for a referral. You might be able to access the information to know for sure whether or not they do have a diagnosis that would be explored or on the FASD spectrum. It is important to note here that there are a number of diagnoses that a child might hold that are not necessarily the letters FASD. So we are still seeing diagnoses like ARND, alcohol-related neurodeficits. I've just said that, and I wish Claire was here to nod. You know, when you say something and then question it, and you're like, oh my gosh, was that right? Anyway, ARND. It's still pre-birth alcohol exposure. It's still an FASD-related diagnosis. So FASD is a spectrum, and we do have all these different letters and different terminology that come under that. So it might be that you're working with a student who has a diagnosis of ARND, for example, or FAS, or partial FAS, or, you know, different things, but it's all comes under the pre-birth alcohol exposure umbrella. So you still approach it as if it was FASD. So with that, as I said, you might be in a position to refer them, you might be in a position to gain that knowledge, but diagnosis, particularly here in the UK and more so England, is still really, really challenging. So the services specialising in diagnosis of FASD are still limited, growing quickly, but they are still limited. This will change, we hope, with the release of the NICE quality standards, but it's still a challenge. So what I'm trying to say here is that if you suspect FASD within your classroom, within your school, within a child that you've been working with or supporting, the best advice, which we've mentioned before, is to go away and do the research, try and learn about it, listen to a few more of our podcasts, see if you can just build a better picture. And when you're confident or even semi-confident that that's what you're working with, or if you feel that it provides some sort of explanation as to what's going on with this child, then listen to our future episodes where we share some strategies and just try and put some of the things in place. See what you can do to help that child, because there are strategies and there are things that can be done. And like I said before, it can only help. It can't harm them. It may work, it may not work, but it's worth a try, because if that child is really struggling in school, then we wouldn't want them to go down a pathway that we were discussing last week, where disengagement from education can result in loss of life, and that that really extreme pathway that we were talking about. So that probably wasn't as brief as I intended, but I just wanted to jump on and still share a little bit of this information in Claire's absence. We hope to have her back next week so that we can have a proper two-way chat and bounce off each other, because it completely changes the dynamic of these podcasts. So if you've made it this far, I really appreciate you listening and bearing with me all the way into the end of this episode. As always, please get in touch via social media, share this with any educator friends. There is lots and lots and lots more coming around education. And as I said at the start, if you're working in this area, if you're keen to come on as a guest, share some thoughts, share some ideas with us, we would love to have you. So thank you very much for listening. Take care and have a wonderful weekend.